Thanks, Surf. So, as a means of introduction, I'm an assistant professor in the philosophy department here at the University of Maastricht. My specialization is the philosophy of technology, which I realize not a lot of people know about. And I'm Surf's MA thesis supervisor, so yeah, he's really got to write a good thesis after today, I think. So my talk today, I want to talk really about the post-capitalist movement, I suppose, and their relationship within a critical philosophy of technology, and what are they doing that other writers have done, and what distinguishes them, but also thinking seriously about the role of technologies. And the ideas we have about technology are inherently philosophical, and when we think seriously about philosophy of technology, we think seriously about what technology can do and what it can't do. And so I was interested in the accelerationist and post-capitalist movement because a lot of their arguments resonated with philosophers of technology that I was familiar with. And what I liked about the accelerationists and the post-capitalists is how they imagined the technological infrastructure of the 21st century to be both the basis of neoliberal capitalism, but also the foundation by which we can transcend the bounds of neoliberal capitalism. This sort of dialectical approach to digital technology, automation, things like that. And I think that the best way to describe their approach would be a concrete utopianism. And they begin. I'm always reminded of Bertolt Brecht, who said, you know, we can't go backwards. We can't start from the good old things, but we have to start from the bad new things. And that's what the accelerationists and post-capitalists do. They begin from the technology of today, and they begin to see potentials within that technology. And so this is some of the demands. And full automation, for example, is not a new demand. The automation of the workforce is something that's been argued by, beginning with industrial capitalism, Karl Marx in the 19th century, and I'm going to talk a bit about Marx and his ideas of technology, Herbert Marcuse and his ideas about technology, and then see how these relate to contemporary ideas. And then in the conclusion of my talk, I want to bring up some questions about assumptions about what technology is and what it can and can't do. Because sometimes we endow technology with an almost magical quality. I mean, where's my flying car, right? My dad always had this book from the 1960s and 50s that flying cars are the future, as if there's an inevitable trajectory which technology is on. And so as a philosopher of technology, I'm always interested in thinking about how technology is implicated within these scenarios, the assumptions about technology, but also the plans for technology. What can automation really do? Are the claims of full automation, is this true? Just because we can imagine it, how does it actually work? And this is what I want to talk about a bit about today. And so in a very broad sense, what I do in the philosophy of technology can be characterized by a couple sayings. So one of the famous sayings is, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. We have to get out of thinking about technology as good or bad and ask different questions. And what we begin to see is that technology we have the technologies we do because they're intertwined with particular social, political, and economic contexts. Technological design, technological use is dependent upon the context within which it's developed. Technologies that are successful, technologies that work better than anything else, fail. Why do they fail? Because of non-technological reasons. And this is, once we begin to understand the context through which technologies are developed, we can begin to understand why it is that we have the technologies that we do. Identifying these contexts really opens up the idea that all technologies are biased. And this word biased usually has a negative connotation, but how many people here are left-handed? The world is technologically against you, right? It is, and the world is technologically biased for right-handed people. That's what bias is. I get ink on my hands every time I write in a notebook because I'm left-handed, and it's biased. That's what a bias is. And recognizing these contexts, I mean, that's a rather mundane example, opens up those questions of why we have the technologies that we do, but it also opens up the question that we can redesign technologies to realize new values and new ideals. We could live in a world that's built for left-handed people. Oh, I'll be in heaven, that would be great. But of course, there are more serious issues, right? We could talk about production technologies, manufacturing technologies, factories. Factories are designed to maximize productivity and not maximize the worker's experience. One could imagine a world, for example, in which technological projects transcend the fixed parameters of capitalism to better reflect contexts oriented towards reskilling labor or environmental responsibility or a renewed attitude towards consumption. And so we begin to think that technology is what it is only within a particular context, that the same technology in a different context is a different technology. So think about something like a factory. A factory presupposes a capitalist division of labor. Mental work, physical work are kept in two separate buildings. Manufacturing doesn't have to be organized that way. It's organized that way because it fits within a particular context. There's famous photographs. There's an American photographer called Louis Hine, and he took photos of factories in the late 19th century in the United States. What's interesting about most child labor was a real thing in the 19th century. Machines were designed for children, and these photographs really emphasize that. And it's a design decision now that looks completely out of whack because the machines only go up to here on an adult. But at that time, it was completely normal because the context of child labor shaped the design of the technologies itself. Now, of course, we make manufacturing technologies for adults because to put children in a factory would seem absurd and illegal. And so we can begin to see the worlds that are reproduced through technological design if we think about technology from a philosophical perspective. Now, the critical philosophy of technology that I work with, I trace it back to the work of Marx. And I mean, Marx is, he wrote a lot of books. And to work your way through his entire printed works would take a long time. And so attempting to draw out what could be considered a critical philosophy of technology is interesting because Marx was one of the first people who recognized that the technology that characterized the Industrial Revolution could be otherwise. It could be designed differently. He began to recognize the contingent aspects of manufacturing technology in the 19th century. He believed that industrial technology was disastrous, the intensification of labor beyond all natural restrictions, de-skilling. If you think about if you're very skilled at manufacturing a particular product and I want your labor, the best thing for me to do is de-skill your labor. Break it down into 25 different jobs. Each of those jobs you don't need a lot of skill for, and I can pay somebody less to do that particular job. That's a contingent aspect of the capitalist organization of labor. Marx is quite critical of machinery, but his critique is directed at the use of machinery under capitalism, not against machinery. He did not want to be mistaken for a cheap Luddite or something like that. He saw machinery and industrialization as the basis of transcendence of the contemporary system. But he critiqued the design of machinery, for example. So he wrote, "Machinery is the most powerful weapon for repressing strikes. It would be possible to write quite a history of machines for the sole purpose of supplying capital with weapons against the revolts of the working class." In other words, Marx was saying that the design of the machines is intentional. It's designed to stop people from having strikes. We de-skill workers. We disempower them. This is completely contingent. It could be otherwise. The point here is that technical design is flexible and contingent upon social and economic ideals. It's not inherent to machinery to maximize surplus value at the expense of the working experience. But Marx is also very hopeful and optimistic. In the Grundrisse, he argues that capitalism has succeeded in developing machinery in which the amount of labor necessary to produce socially necessary goods is at a minimum. Food, clothing, shelter, transportation, all of these things in the 19th century could be produced quite easily relative to the preceding centuries. In the hands of capital, minimizing labor time is pursued only to maximize production. So if we're able to make a particular product in a shorter amount of time, we use that time to produce more products. There's a labor process theorist named Harry Braverman who said, when management decides upon production standards, never is any level of production sufficient. So we just produce more and more and more goods. Moving beyond the dictates of the capital, though, one can imagine that the same machinery directed towards minimizing labor could also produce socially necessary goods while simultaneously decreasing the labor necessary to do this. So here, even in Marx writing in the 1860s, we begin to see some of the ideas that are articulated by Cernusek and Williams, post-capitalism, things like that. The idea that we have the manufacturing capability to produce those things that we need with a minimum amount of labor. But instead of producing that thing and opening up free time, we produce more and more socially unnecessary goods, you could say. Marx cleverly pointed this out. He said, capital, quite intentionally, has reduced necessary human labor through machinery, and this is the condition of emancipated labor. Only by freeing ourselves from pursuing these goods, capital has provided the tools by which we can free ourselves from capitalism. It's a very... he was a clever guy, that Marx, yeah. And so we begin to see here the origins of a critical philosophy of technology, that the technology at hand, the means of production and consumption, contain within it the potential to move beyond the system as it is. In the 20th century, Herbert Marcuse took up these ideas. Again, he's writing in he's a German philosopher who was writing in the United States in 1964 when he wrote this book, One-Dimensional Man, which really was a very popular book amongst the social activists of the 1960s. He was really lauded by the May 68 in Paris. He taught in San Diego, and so the left-wing groups in California really took to him as well. He argued that contemporary industrial society in the 1960s delivers the goods like never before. And the consequence of that is that it's very difficult for people to think beyond the system as it is. I mean, 1964 America, this is the America that the current president wanted to make great again, right? The suburbs, the car, the shopping, everything was there. And so it was very difficult to articulate an alternative to this particular society. And for Marcuse, this was problematic because it's necessary to imagine alternatives, to use the machinery of capitalism to create a different order, a different world. And so he argues that modern technologies provided us with a life of unprecedented wealth. I mean, this has continued today. In 2017, we are probably the wealthiest humans who have ever walked the planet. The amount of goods and services on hand at any given time is unfathomable to people who lived hundreds of years ago. Marcuse argued that the system of mass production and mass consumption is the basis of industrial capitalism, and that we're all invested in this system. He would write something like, if the laborer who works on the assembly line, the taxi driver, the doctor, the venture capitalist, the banker, the student, the professor, if you all desire the same goods, say a smartphone or a laptop or a car, it's in your best interest to support a system that provides that to you. And so for Marcuse, there was a real lack of dialectical thought. There was a lack of being able to imagine something beyond what was given. And Marcuse proposed that, like Marx, that the reality that we could realistically provide food, shelter, and clothing to everybody on Earth. Why don't we? This sounds like a basic question. So we began to look at the psychology of capitalism, the organization of industrial capitalism, to argue that to open up potentials, we would say. And he does a really interesting point on this. I mean, one of the good things about the critical philosophy of technology as well is that it doesn't subscribe to this back to nature movement that was popular with, say, people like the Romantics, I would say, of the late 19th century. Both Marx, Marcuse, they don't believe that industrialization is a wrong turn. It's a necessary turn to help us move to the next stage of civilization. It's a bit deterministic historicism, but the foundation of socialism for both Marcuse and Marx was the technological infrastructure of capitalism. We need that infrastructure to be able to provide for us the basic necessities of life. And paying close attention and identifying how technology is intertwined with the lives that we lead allows us to develop new ideas for the future that are intertwined with those technologies. And this is where post-capitalism becomes interesting. Accelerationist post-capitalists. I saw you spoke about the Cernusek and Williams book and Paul Mason and people like that. Now, they're talking about a different technology than Marx and Marcuse would discuss. They're talking a lot, mainly digital technologies, automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, things like that. What's interesting about post-capitalism is they take up the same arguments, right? In the hands of a corporation like Facebook or Apple, digital technologies are necessarily used for the interests of generating profit. These same technologies in the hands of different groups and different individuals could be directed towards different ends. That we could use a social network system that doesn't rely on collecting and selling data. That the digital organization of logistics, for example, could be used to provide greater distribution of food or clothing or shelter, but instead it's being used to maximize profits for the people that can afford it. And so what's interesting about Cernusek and Williams and this post-capitalist movement is that their historical framework is quite different. They don't begin, my supervisor for my PhD, he was a classic baby boomer, went through the 60s, all that sort of stuff, and it was tiresome after a while. I like Cernusek and Williams because for them, history begins in the 1970s. The oil crisis is the beginning of the present. Thatcher, Reagan, there are no good old days to look back to. Anybody born after 1970, we don't have this 1960s flower power stuff to look back to. We have, Thatcher, Reagan, I lived through that. Oh, who knew? And this is the world we inhabit now. The world we inhabit now, you could almost argue, has been in a state of crisis for more than 40 years. From the oil to the systematic destruction of the working class movement in the United States, the destruction of labor unions. The end of the Cold War has not brought us any closer to peace or prosperity. It's been nothing but these series. And so I like these writers because they present a view on history that I find sympathetic to my own experiences, that I find really, really nice. And so they argue that we need utopian visions. And philosophically, utopian visions are important because they point to something beyond what is given. Full automation, basic income, these ideas, they seem rather radical and utopian, but this is important, Cernusek and Williams argue, because we need this as to point us in the right direction. We can't just simply describe the world as it is, we have to think about the world as it could be. Those two things have to be connected when thinking about a critical examination with society. And so they argue that contemporary technological imaginations are bound to the dictates of neoliberal capitalism, resulting in a very tightly bound world where one imagines technological development solely as marginally better consumer gadgets. A new iPhone. What's the thing I see on TV? These 3D masks that people put on. I mean, how does that make life better? It just makes life neater. Neat is not better. This is the technological trajectory. It's just better gadgets you can see at MediaMarkt or something like that. And this is their critique, is that we need to direct technology towards different ends, that design itself is flexible, that use and the way we think about technology is contingent upon the values that we have. Technology is not a neutral thing that exists outside of humanity or outside of the social world. And so what they argue is very interesting. Automation, universal basic income, using the tools of early 21st century neoliberal capitalism towards new ends. So digital infrastructures, artificial intelligence, robotics, all of these technologies are the foundation that will allow us to transcend the limitations of the contemporary world and push us towards a post-capitalist world, you could say. And so they argue that full automation would result in a reduction of labor time necessary to produce essential goods and services. This leads to a reduced working week, complemented by a universal basic income, all of it built upon a foundation of technology. And so when I read the post-capitalist work, the accelerationist work, I read it as a work of philosophy of technology and as a work within the philosophy of technology. And because I'm a professor and my job is to critique things, I began to look at not the holes in their arguments, but questions that I had about their assumptions about technology. I think the quote that they have in the book, I guess you like quotes. So I think the one quote they had in the book that I found really interesting, that resonated with what Marx was saying, with what Marcuse was saying, with what Mumford was saying, all these philosophers, they write, a new world will have to be built not on the ruins of the old, but on the most advanced elements of the present. And so that's interesting because a lot of critical theorists believe that we have to reject the contemporary world. We have to go back to the good old days. But they're saying, no, we have to embrace the technological infrastructure of the present and transform it to better meet the goals that we have. Goals around environmentalism, reduction of the work week, we'll say the good life, so to speak, which is a big topic in philosophy of technology. So this is a brief summary of 175 years of the philosophy of technology. But what I want to do now is to think seriously about some of the claims that they make, because it's a very inspiring program, we could say, the post-capitalists have. But the key component is not just ideas or conversation, it's also technology itself. And so some of the questions I had about the technology or this program, the first one is who exactly are the agents of social change? For Marx, it was the working class. The working class would be the agents of social change. Marcuse, the working class had been subsumed within capitalism, and he saw progressive social change as developing out of the margins of society. So in the 1960s United States, you could see that with minorities, homosexuals and lesbians, students, of course, and what he called the unemployed and unemployable. This is where progressive social change needs to occur through marginalized people. And so when I read Cernusek and Williams, one of the questions I had is, who are the agents of revolutionary change, this progressive change? I don't think in the Western world the labor unions are as strong as they once were. And so the working class, is this the agent of revolutionary change? Is it students? Is it the intelligentsia, we should say? And this is an interesting question because without that critical mass and organization, it's very difficult to move these ideas forward. There's still a bit of technological determinism, I find, in the post-capitalist movement. The idea that technological determinism could be defined as the belief that technology determines the social world and that it develops of its own logic. That historically, you can write history so that the technology we have today is the natural continuum of everything that came before it. This is false. Technologies develop, we don't know what comes next. Technologies, through empirical work of technological innovation and development, what people see is that there are reasons we have the technologies that we do, and they're not technological, that they have a lot to deal with the choices that people make. So think of something as simple as the organization of the keys on your computer. Does anybody know why the keyboard is laid out that way? Because of the typewriter. Economic. Nope. It's actually the least efficient way, but it develops out of the typewriter. How many of you ever typed on a typewriter? Yeah. What happens when with the arms? They get stuck. You have to have an angle, but the keys that you use the most have to be the most separated from each other, because if you use two letters the same, what happens? The arms get stuck. So the reason that the computer is designed the way it is, the keyboard, dates back to the typewriter and decisions about that. In the 60s, they tried to create a new type of keyboard that was more efficient, that improved, nobody took to it. The organization of the keyboard is irrational from a computational 21st century perspective, but it's what we use. And there are numerous examples of technologies that are biased or designed to have particular biases. Even something like this microphone. University microphones are designed to fit the shirts of men, right? What does that say? See, when I give this in lecture, men are like, what? Shirts are all designed the same way. Women, are all button-up blouses designed the same way? No. And so the intention is that people who speak in a classroom have men's shirts on. Sorry? They still are. Yeah, they still are mostly men. And see, that idea is designed in the technology itself. And so sometimes when I read the post-capitalist stuff, there's this belief that because we can imagine what artificial intelligence can do, it will happen. If you know the history of artificial intelligence, beginning in the 1960s with Newell and Simon and Marvin Minsky, they always say 5 to 10 years, 5 to 10 years, 5 to 10 years, 5 to 10 years. The fact is that human intelligence can't be reduced to binary logic. It's a simple philosophical challenge of, you can't put, thinking is not facts, intelligence is not facts. It's more than just simply the collection of numbers and data. And the assumption that artificial intelligence is somehow can replicate human intelligence is not a path to go down. So thinking seriously about the assumptions about automation and artificial intelligence is an important point if we really want these ideas to take hold. And that naive faith in some sort of autonomous trajectory of technology is not irresponsible, but it's important to pay close attention to the design of these things. If we want automation to reduce the working week, then we need to design manufacturing technology that takes that idea into place. Just as the manufacturing technologies of the 19th century were designed to maximize productivity for profit, manufacturing technologies in the 21st century need to be designed to reduce labor. And this can happen at the empirical level. And if you don't do it at that level, it won't happen. Technology doesn't design itself. And so when I read these articles, this is what I felt, was that the attention to technology was a little bit naive at times. And so those 2 points, I have a few other here, but I'm more interested in what you guys think. So it's Saturday, so I didn't want to give you the whole 10-minute or 10-page spiel that I give to conferences. So, but I'm really excited to hear your questions or comments about this, because obviously technology plays a foundational role in the ideals and aspirations of the post-capitalist movement. And so, yeah, like I said, I'm interested in what you think about the role of technology in these future developments. Thank you. Oh, post-capitalism? So it's the idea that we're on the brink of moving beyond capitalism. So what happens after capitalism? So things like universal basic income or full automation, we no longer have to sell our labor for money to buy goods and services. So what comes next? And what is the role of technology within that particular scenario? I don't think artificial intelligence will come to be in the way it's being described. I don't think human intelligence can ever be replicated exactly. When you watch movies where robots act like humans, no.
Like the technological singularity that
No.
you were talking about?
No. It's based on Cartesian rationalism, right? It's based on the idea that the world that we experience can be broken up into different discrete bits, which in turn can be like zeros and ones that can be put into a brain. But that's not how we think, right? So mathematically or through physics, I can explain how I ride my bike. But when I'm riding my bike, I'm not reflecting upon riding my bike. It's intuitive. They did studies on experts in the 60s and 70s. Expert doctors, expert fighter jet pilots, expert chess players, things like that. And what they began to recognize was that at the learning level, you follow explicit rules. And these rules could be inputted into a computer. But at the expert level, you don't follow rules. In fact, you just sort of, anybody who... Sorry? You follow it intuitively. So if you play an instrument or you do sports or things like that, how you teach somebody how to do it is very different than if you do it at an expert level. You know, if it was mathematically possible, then everybody would be Beethoven. But what makes Beethoven a great pianist is his ability to transcend the rules. And so if you're interested, there's a writer called Hubert Dreyfus. And he began writing about artificial intelligence in the 1960s, especially on this point, basically arguing that the foundation of artificial intelligence is a mistaken notion of what intelligence is. Now we have neural networks, deep learning, things like that, which is pushing it in a different direction than what it was in the 1960s and 70s. And I teach at the Department of Knowledge Engineering with AI enthusiasts, and I teach them Dreyfus, and they all say the same thing. It's so fascinating. Well, I don't believe it, but yeah. Well, because their income depends on the idea. And what do we hear about contemporary artificial intelligence? 5 or 10 years we'll be there. 5 or 10 years we'll be there. well, 1962, 5 or 10 years will be there. 1975, and it's just this. It's actually psychologically interesting because it's the right amount of time where it's far enough away so that we don't expect anything this year, but it's not so far away that it's in our lifetime. And yeah, 7.5 years from now, you're like, I can wait that long. I don't expect anything today, but 7.5 years, that's no problem. All right, I'll have a robot who's going to help me do all my work. And advancements within robotics and artificial intelligence are incredible. Don't get me wrong, but I think some of the claims and the ambitions are misguided. They're based on a view of human intelligence. Like, we don't know what human consciousness is. We don't know how consciousness works. We have ideas. For example, you could hook up, you could see what happens if you laugh. I could hook up a variety of different technologies to your brain and see what happens when you actually laugh. In 2017, that would probably be used to develop a pharmaceutical drug that you could take to feel like you're laughing all the time. But what I can't do is to understand why you're laughing, right? And that's the difference. I can know what happens when you laugh, but I can't explain why you laugh. A joke that would be funny to me as a Canadian might not be funny to Surf as a Dutch person, right? So we would laugh for two different reasons, and that's as important to consciousness as intelligence as everything else. But we'll see. I think I'm more, yeah.
5 or 10 years.
5 or 10 years, we'll see. Yeah. At the back, I think, or. My optimism is from, it's possible. The potential is there. So you think about manufacturing technologies, right? Basic machinery, not even thinking about the digital world. The potential is there to provide the basic necessities for people. That potential you can't argue with. Transportation, clothing, food, shelter, it's all there. It's the way that it's organized that is different. And I agree with you, neoliberalism. No, neoliberalism is accelerating to a degree that is, there's no alternative, right? It's Thatcher's and Reagan's 1980s. There is no alternative to a free market-based system. And that's true. And it's even more so true today than it has been in 10 or 15 years. And this gets to my last point about where resistance comes from. And for resistance to occur, you need to have that optimism, I think. You just can't simply describe how terrible things are. That's an easy task. The difficult task is identifying where these moments of resistance come in, to the point where you could say, well, this is what the Cernusek and Williams and Postcapitalism argument was, and that's where I see them in this continuum. And so just as Marx saw industrialization as the necessary stepping stone to socialism, we could say it still exists today. So the question is, why haven't we done that? Opening those moments of resistance. But that optimism is always there. We're humans. We're capable of amazing things, In 1925, nobody would imagine we walked on the moon. I use Skype like it's nothing, right? And I remember watching 2001: A Space Odyssey going, it'll never happen. It'll never happen. You'll never talk. How are you going to phone in sick for work when you're not really? And this is what's happening. And so we can see that potential all the time with, what is it? The future is unwritten. And I think we see within the material infrastructure of society spaces for resistance. But the question of ownership becomes very important in the 21st century as we begin to think more about robotics. And the question is not what robots can do. An important question is who owns the robots, right? Who owns the digital infrastructure of the internet? When Amazon is selling data space, this is important, right? This is probably, Amazon owns the Washington Post. That's how we get our books. And now they have server space. If Amazon goes down, the internet goes down for big chunks of the internet. That ownership in private hands is a very, very interesting detail which may present further problems up the road, because all of these things are designed within a capitalist framework. I own robots because I want to maximize productivity to increase my profits. Not I own robots because I want to create a more equitable distribution of wealth and have people leave their jobs. And those intentions are, I would say, designed into the technology itself. And unfortunately, we tend to think of technology as neutral, so we don't ask those questions. But yeah, I hope my optimism rubs off a bit. Okay, at the back? Yes. I'll speak briefly about patents in a philosophical sense. Patents change the way we think about technology. Patents convince us that technologies come from one particular person, right? Because what a patent does is it endows ownership typically on one person. Technologies are never invented by one person. That's the myth. And it allows us to think of these geniuses that toil away in their garages. We keep thinking that way, we're going to keep believing in a deterministic idea of technology. Patents, copyright, intellectual property endow technologies that should be all of ours with a sense of ownership and property. So think about manufacturing technologies. This is what Marx wrote about. This is what Kurt Vonnegut, the novelist, wrote about in the book Player Piano. A manufacturing technology is simply the materialization of human skill, right? How does a machine know how to make a product? Where does it come from? If I have a machine that makes wheels, it's simply duplicating the labor of a human. That human labor is materialized in the machine itself, but that machine is not owned by the human. It's owned by the person who has the patent. Patents, all of these things, they, at a philosophical level, transform the way that we think about technology. Who was it? It was Benjamin Franklin who said he refused to take out patents on his inventions because he said something like, "He who lights his torch from mine gains without my loss." Right? And that's a different way of thinking about it, that why do I need to benefit from design, from innovation, from developments? And I think philosophically we need to think seriously about that. But patents, intellectual property, I think in the realm of agriculture, this is probably one of the key ideas. This is one of the grounds where this is being debated. We've seen the debates with music and films and all that sort of stuff, but biotechnology, I've read some interesting papers on that. And it's the notion that we can endow things with a sense of property, that we can make things property. That, I mean, in the biotech industry, there's nothing inherent to an object that makes it a form of property. We created the system of copyright to do this, and systematically we can change it as well. And so patents are very important for developing the way that we think about technology, I would say.
That's an extreme, but
yeah, that's the sort of paperclip theory of AI, the doomsday scenario, as Nick Bostrom writes about this as well. And I would say, I don't fall that far into that debate, but I would say all technologies have unintended consequences. Everything, you know. When Henry Ford was developing, or when diesel was developing the internal combustion engine, he never considered environmental degradation or suburbs. Right? Suburbs are a consequence of automobiles. Without a car, you can't live in the greater Toronto area or Levittown, New Jersey, or something like that. And so recognizing these unintended consequences is important, because then we fall out of the idea that there's a technological fix, right? And I think that's part of the deterministic solution, is that AI will solve the environmental problem. No, humans will, with the help of technology, like everything we do. But those technologies, once we begin to think about unintended consequences, then we need to move away from that sort of technology is the savior, technology is the great destroyer, and rather think about how technology can be designed and implemented to better meet the needs of a more humane planet. So sustainability. So what are the ideals of sustainability? How are technologies designed right now to be not sustainable? So an automobile, for example. Automobiles don't have to be designed to hold 4 people. They were designed that way because the nuclear family was the standard in the United States at that time. How many people are often in a car? 1, right? It's a question of sustainability right there. Cars could be smaller. I'm from North America. Everybody's got a gigantic car now. Again, it's the ways in which we invest these technologies with meaning, and the ways in which meanings and ideas are there at the design stage. And there's a famous story Langdon Winter, the philosopher of technology, told about bridges in New York. Robert Moses, the urban planner in New York, was racist, and he built Jones Beach in Long Island, and he didn't want non-whites visiting the beach. So in the 1950s, most non-white people took buses. So all of the overpasses on the Long Island Expressway are shorter than normal, so buses can't go under them. Bridges are racist, right? There is no, the cement itself, of course, is neutral, but all technical elements, once they're put together in a system and used by humans and designed by humans, have these human biases as well. It's no different than left-handed or right-handed. What did I have when I was a kid? Left-handed scissors? Oh, they were terrible. Trying to cycle in a city that doesn't have a cycling infrastructure, right? Ramps, accessibility for disabled people, depending on the country you're in, right? We don't notice these things, but buildings are biased for the able-bodied people. All of these biases are built in, and recognizing this is key. And so a concept like sustainability or environmentalism becomes important because we can actually trace at the micro level how these ideals are reproduced through technological design. This is an interesting question as well, is what is the scale of change, right? Is it the local? Is it the universal? And I think in 2017, what is the local, right? In the 90s, the local was the community. If Facebook has billions of users, what is the local? 10 million people? 100,000 people, right? So I think in today's world, we need to rethink the scale upon which we use these terms local and global. I don't know enough about, I've read so much on blockchain, and unfortunately, Marx is easier than Bitcoin for me at this point. But
it's not just Bitcoin.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, I know
we could
blockchain.
go
Yeah,
a whole day about it.
yeah, yeah.
I truly think that the blockchain is the answer to most of the problems that have been.
And who's getting involved with blockchain now?
Well,
Who's sponsoring it?
depends. Like
The banks.
You have big corporates because they see
The banks.
The banks, because that's their threat.
They see it as it's like the oil industry right now is funding most of the alternative energy because they're no longer oil companies, they're energy companies. The banks are no longer about money, they're about finance and capital. And so this is where these things were at key moments, you could say, because the design decisions that are being made now will become neutral. Right? We don't think of a car as biased towards the nuclear family. We just think, if you see a car designed for one person, you think, oh, that's weird. It's only weird because what we're used to is taken as objective and neutral. In 20 years, what blockchain is may have been developed because of particular interests. And what we can do with it and what we can't do with it will be sorted out. And the potential is there. But we also have to recognize that other people see that potential and other organizations with different interests. And paying attention, my task is to examine how those ideals are realized within the technical sphere. Why are technologies designed as this and not that? That sorts of questions. I think at least the Cernusek and Williams stuff that I've read, their complete rejection of localism is problematic. They're rejecting labor unions, they're rejecting decades of strong organizations. Mason's work on economics is interesting, and for a non-economist like myself who reads the stuff but doesn't really know it, it can be convincing. But the politics I see it more as optimism than anything else. I read these books and I don't see them as concrete proposals, I see them as starting points. And so as a philosopher of technology, I see that my task is how do we get it more concrete? How do we investigate these places where technologies that are implicated in these post-capitalist discussions, what's actually happening in the design? Who's designing it? What's the process? Who makes decisions? Where do their funding come from? You know, these sorts of questions, and tracing that allows us to see the concrete details of the very idealistic plans. But anything that gets people talking about the potential of technology, that I agree with. But it's not the end point. It's like what I tell my students about Wikipedia. It's never the end point, it's the starting point for more debates and more concrete research.
But it just feels like this isn't a discussion which is starting fresh. You know, Marx has been doing this for a while, so I don't know, I find sometimes the discussion about post-capitalism is strange because it tries to not do politics and has so much overlap with sort of socialist communist traditions.
Yeah.
Where socialist and communist traditions have models of organizing and have kind of ideas and like a better understanding of power, in my opinion. And then post-capitalism wants to produce something similar towards the ends of a sort of socialist or communist project without really engaging with the ugliness of what might be required to...
Yeah, I agree. And this is the stuff that I write about post-capitalism is exactly this, why their attitudes towards technology are a bit naive. Or anytime you engage in these types of discussions, I think you really need to address why it failed in the past. Why haven't we accomplished those things that Marx pointed at 160 years ago? What are you doing that's different? How do you intend to deal with these potential problems and these power relationships that have existed for centuries? You can't just simply come up with they come up with an idea, but the next step is then taking it further. The critiques that you mentioned, these are important and they need to be part of the discussion. And so, yeah, you can't, English phrase, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can critique it, but still keep the kernel of the idea there, yeah. So, yeah, with babies being thrown out, I think that's... Thank you very much. Those are good questions. Yeah.